Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Today I'm speaking with sports psychologist James Claffey. Now James is currently consultant for the Professional Footballers Association of Ireland, alongside holding a variety of positions, such as a course director, a lecturer in psychology and a consultant with teams and individuals in multiple sports. This guy has a fantastic CV and a wealth of knowledge to share with us all. James, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hi everybody, thanks very much first of all, Dan, for having me on. I must say it's been a long time coming and very feel privileged to be part of the show and obviously to chat with yourself. I've been a big admirer for a long time, so thanks for having me on.
No, well, thanks for coming on. We've been trying to do this for quite a bit of time. You're a busy man, so getting in that diary of yours has been challenging. But I'm delighted to have you on. I've heard rave reviews about the work you're doing over there in Dublin, in Cork, and across Ireland. Everyone will have heard your soft Dublin accent there. So that's where you're based, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm based in Dublin, so I'd work out of Dublin the majority of the week, and then I live in Cork with my wife Thursday through Monday most weeks. And obviously the benefits of having a teaching job is you have some time off then as well, which is fantastic.
Absolutely, and I'll tell you what caught my eye, and I think I saw it, I can't remember if it was LinkedIn or on Twitter, this consultancy position for the Professional Footballers Association of Ireland, and it's just wonderful to see, a governing body, an association engaging in sports psychology or engaging a sports psychologist to work with their footballers. James, how did that come about, and what's going on with that at the moment, and how does that work for you? Tell us what you can about that.
Yeah, well, it came about by chance, really, like a lot of things, I guess. It came from a discussion with a friend of mine who put me forward, who was speaking with the General Secretary of the PFEI and Mr. Steve McGuinness, and I ended up meeting Stephen and had a really good conversation. We spoke about the players, we spoke about their mental health, their physical health, etc., and so on. And what we came to at the end of the discussion was that there was great scope to try and implement change for these players who might need help with it. There's another person working with them at the moment, or maybe working in the future, in relation to psychology as well, and I only had a discussion with him about this yesterday. But it's always refreshing, and I think it's what kind of drew me to your own work, to be honest, Dan, and I say this very genuinely when I mean it, that the whole psychosocial model, it really struck a chord with me, and when I spoke to the PFEI, they were under the same impression that it has to be about the person first and the athlete second, and I really believe that that's the best way to go about things in order to be, I suppose, managing people on a day-to-day basis.
So, that sounds like an enormous job in terms of, is it sort of every professional player in Ireland can get in contact and say, you know what, I feel like I want to see James or whoever else is working there, and it's just set up, an appointment is set up. Is that kind of how it works, or is
absolutely. So it's very much like every other form of consultancy. They would contact the PFEI, and then the PFEI would contact me, and like everything else, I think one of the things we spoke about previously was that you have to have the professionalism to know when it gets to a stage where referral happens, and fair play to the PFEI, they do a great job at that. They have a clinical psychologist as well, so when it gets past, as we often say, the lifestyle choices, etc., it's time to refer. We're not omnipotent, we don't have all the power, so I think one of the most refreshing things we can do as people and as sports like sometimes is just say it's time to pass them on, because I have a certain set of skills, and sometimes that set of skills aren't there to meet the needs of the individuals.
You know what, historically, James, I've always had, not always, sometimes, less so now, but I've had coaches, football coaches, soccer coaches say to me, well, Dan, how is, football psychological? It's such a quick, instinctive sport. Obviously, we're talking about the performance piece here. It's such a quick instinctive sport, there's no time to think, how can it be psychological? And they kind of ignore the clinical mental health piece. They don't necessarily take into account the well-being and welfare. And then the performance piece itself, I think, is a misunderstanding of the way the brain is structured and how it functions. That the game might work in seconds, but the brain and the nervous system kind of work in milliseconds. So brain trumps the game for speed every single time. But have you come up against much pushback in your work with players over in Ireland? Are they open-minded? Do they see its importance?
Generally speaking, you come across 2 or 3 people who would be already interested maybe in psychology and have read a couple of things about it, and for the 3 or 4 of them, or the 5 or 6, there is a lot of interest there, but there is a little bit of pushback, I guess. I think we spoke about it previously, saying that sadly when we use that word psychology, there's still that tiny piece of the white coat syndrome where they feel, oh, what's wrong with me? Are you here to fix? And I have it up on numerous times. I've spoke about it on social media, etc. It's not a case of us being reactive to things that might have gone wrong. It's us being proactive and giving people new skill sets, not just for sport but for life. When we think of some of the major components or theories that people refer to when they speak to sport and exercise psychology, or indeed performance psychology, we'll refer to goal setting. Well, obviously it's fantastic in a sports-based setting, but goal setting is your life. It's your map for your life, so it's important to be able to relate that back to yourself in relation to your life. And also day-to-day activities. I often joke with students in relation to visualization and mental imagery. I say, have we all done this? And some, you get a little pushback, oh, I've never done it previously, or I haven't. And you think, what about the phone call to your boss when you can't go to work? So you mentally rehearse that. You never just do that the first time. It's always in your head, okay, I'm going to say I'm not well, I won't be in today. And you've almost mentally rehearsed it 2 or 3 times before that call is made.
And it's interesting, isn't it? As you were talking there, I was thinking about how just people do it, don't they? If you take something as basic as mental rehearsal and visualization, and that's a tiny proportional fraction of what we do as sports psychs, but when you take something as basic as that, and as you quite rightly said there, we do that. Everybody does that naturally. It's just helping people tweak it, isn't it? It's just about, for instance, what would it look like if I have an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 game on Saturday in this match? What will others see? How will I feel? What runs, what movement, what actions will I do? As you alluded to there, when I get on the phone to my boss and I've got to have that awkward call, what would a good performance on that call look like? So it's kind of tweaking that mental rehearsal and visualization.
Yeah, 100%. And I think from reading your own research and your books and stuff like that, what I really appreciate with it, and I think anybody involved in the sports sciences will as well, is that we can make it objective. We're going to make it quantifiable. So what is an 8 out of 10? Does that mean a 70-80% pass completion rate? Does it mean I've covered this amount of ground? And I always believe that for coaches, the more objective we can be, the more scientific we can be, then it just takes away that subjectivity where it could say, well, Dan isn't playing James because he just doesn't like him. Well, Dan, now the coach says, James, you've ran less this month, you've tackled less this month, your pass completion rate is down, and then maybe it's a chat that you have with the player. And I think that's the beautiful thing about psychology. Sometimes it will go and look at some of the theoretical approaches almost when we look at the psychodynamic, what's happening subconscious with us, that we might have that little dip in motivation that we spoke about previously.
I love what you've just said there, because you're connecting the mental side with the performance side. You alluded to KPIs, key performance indicators, successful pass completion, shots on target, whatever that might be. But then relating that to, well, what's the thinking underpinning that? What's the feeling? What's the conscious thought? And what's possibly, as you alluded to there, the underpinning subconscious thought or feeling? So how do you strive to bring about that conversation? You mentioned coaches there. Do you try to help them relate the KPIs, the key performance indicators, with player thinking, with player feeling?
Yeah, 100%. I think you have to. I think the reality behind it is, as we keep alluding to, or I certainly do, is that they are humans at the end of the day, and it's not a case of hitting them with a huge amount of objective science-based numbers, but it's talking to them on a personal level, because things happen in life, and it could be that the kids weren't dropped off on time, or you had an issue with a parent who wasn't well, or things like that. And I think it's so vitally important. I see clubs all over Europe using these fits in terms of our mental health and our well-being, in terms of putting in a score how you feel on a phone. And I think it's part of the problem that we don't sit down with athletes and say, how are you feeling? And I think sometimes, it's almost Freudian, it's almost going back to psychoanalysis, that talking is therapy. And sometimes it's like setting off a grenade. You just say, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? And you step back, and these players and athletes, they come with all of this information that you can then use in a way to help them as a person, obviously, but thereafter their performance will increase because of that then again. So I think it's really, really important. I think one of the things I loved in one of the previous shows was Damien Hughes had spoke about the culture and creating culture, and I think if the players buy into the why, then when you're speaking about the key performance indicators, you've already educated them on that, but more importantly, they've already had interpretation and understanding of it. Because I think sometimes what we do is we try to educate players, and in some cases it's very fruitful. Dan, I don't know if you've come across it, but checking for understanding is the key component for me. It is fine to give up all of this beautiful academic sources, but if they don't understand it, if we can't bring it back down to layman's terms, and if you can't explain it simply, then you can't explain it at all, as the old phrase says.
You alluding to the psychological side there, James? You saying so checking for understanding on the psychological side, as well as checking for understanding on the technical, tactical side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, how do we do that? I think a lot of the times people negate to do it, and it's not a case of creating a big brother culture, but one of the things that we tried implementing was just, there's a quite prominent study called the Hawthorne studies. I'm sure you've come across it previously, but essentially they had checked with these employees that they were going in, and they had informed them about this testing, and they had increased lighting and productivity increased. They had reduced lighting, productivity increased again. And your listeners will probably understand where we're going with this. The whole thing was productivity increased because they were being watched. Now, coaches the world over at youth level and elite level, I've come across it in many different facets. Think of the player who's been out of the team. Think of the player who's eating right and sleeping right and training as hard as every other player, and his only way to get into that side is what the coach sees in training sessions. Now, if that coach puts on a beautiful technical session and then turns and has a conversation with the kit man, or has a conversation with somebody who's there also, this player is vying for a position, and he sees that the coach isn't watching the session, and his motivation will just dip straight away. So one of the things sometimes that we try to do is we track training sessions by monitoring and actually videoing the training session. And I think one of the keys with that, which you alluded to, is we're not always quantifying everything, because psychology doesn't want to always do that. But what we're trying to do is going all the way back to understand people and understand behaviour, or at least try to predict why it's happening in some form.
Well, as you were talking now, I was thinking of the conversation I had with the previous podcast with Doug Lemov, the education advisor, the teaching advisor, and he talked about, as a coach, you're picking up data all the time. Every single second you're looking for behavioural data. So you have to be switched on all the time. And what I love about what you said there, James, is it's the reverse as well. The players are picking up data all the time. They're observing their teammates, they're probably thinking about themselves as well, but they're also observing their coaches. So every action, every behaviour, everything a coach does matters. It really matters, doesn't it? And it sounds to you like you're filming the coaches to make sure that they are engaging in behaviours that is that is helping them connect with players and coach players effectively.
Absolutely, and it's something that you've alluded to previously on the show in relation to our body language and how we do. And I'd heard a lot about a coach maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I just made contact and asked could I watch the session, and they were doing quite well at the time, etc. So on. It wasn't soccer, by the way; it was a different sport. But anyway, long story short, I had gone and watched the session. And one of the key components was, for me, after I watched the session, it was okay technically, it was okay tactically and everything else, but the energy levels and enthusiasm by the coach, it was the kind of clips and snippets that we're seeing now of Guardiola, that if we kind of go back and we hear anecdotal tales of the likes of John Wooden or Vince Lombardi, I mean, I'm constantly reiterating back to these guys all the time, because at the moment, Guardiolism, everybody's all over it at the moment, but John Wooden and Vince Lombardi, these were things that were in effect maybe 50, 60 years ago. And I think your enthusiasm and your own body language, small things like hands in the pockets, it can be destructive for a session if a player sees that when you're asking for high intensity, etc.
Massively, James, and I'm just thinking there of some of the high-profile coaches I've worked with, some of the coaches who are not so high-profile but are absolutely brilliant at exuding that energy, enthusiasm and interest. Interest in their players is such an important thing. To watch great coaches coach, for me, is to watch great enthusiasm, is to watch interest, is to observe a ball of energy in many respects. And what I find interesting about observing the best coaches, James, and I'll get you to comment on this, is that they don't always have to be speaking or instructing to exude that energy. That they can either actually be silent and still be a presence, or they can be simply asking questions. They don't have to be loudly instructing. They can ask questions, but still do so with presence and with an enormous persona.
Yeah, and when it's probably bringing us back to one of the biggest kind of coaching paradigms to which we'll probably come to shortly, was when Musaka Mossen initially came up with the guided discovery method. I think one of the things that I enjoyed most was that, reading from stories and things, that he was a very introverted man, but the whole thing of asking questions and gauging understanding, it was something that was vitally important, and we see it almost the world over now, where every coaching manual at some stage or another will probably refer to guided discovery. And I think that's a key component. And what coaches need to be aware of is that came from somebody who's a physical educator, somebody who's educating people on the physiology of the body and the importance of the body. I remember reading a really fantastic article from Musaka Mossen again in relation to the body as a machine. And just like I've referred to students all the time, we gather energy in two sources, either by the food that we ingest or by our sleep. So we need to educate athletes on this, and how can we do that in a way that will benefit them. So not that you're eating food, but that you're absorbing nutrition. So it's almost, I joke about it sometimes, but it's like Super Mario. He jumps and he hits the mushroom and he grows because of it. And with younger athletes, they love the analogy because it really shows the importance of what happens when we look after our body physiologically, in relation to, let's say, diet and nutrition. But also, I think sometimes I've worked with a lot of different coaches, and even speaking from different sports psychs, I don't know your instance with this, but I do feel that they don't place as much emphasis on sleep patterns and the power of sleep, naps, etc., things like that. I know some clubs have beds in their actual facilities, and it can be very fruitful for that. But as we think about, the more energy we have, the better the machine will perform, i.e. the better we are hydrated, the better the machine will perform, the better we are in terms of nutrition, the better the machine will perform almost.
Well, as we speak now, Marcelo Bielsa is the Leeds manager, and I believe that he installed beds into the training ground at Leeds United. Fantastic. So, that's certainly backed up by quite a good manager, quite a good coach. So how would you, what are the specifics behind that, James, when you talk to coaches about the importance of sleep? What are the kind of things that you're saying to them that convinces them that that's the case?
It's just looking, I suppose, trying to quantify what it is, and again, control the controllables if possible. If we have players with us for 8 hours of the day, we can control that. And you're trying to quantify it, saying when they go out of here, regardless of the information, if they're, let's say, for example, young footballers with plenty of money, chances are they may forget the information that you've given them, and they may just have FIFA open on their computer till 2 a.m. or one of these games, or any video games at all. So I think sometimes being cognizant of when we have them, sometimes the energy levels and what we do, especially when you think of away trips and things like that. So you actually go into the nitty gritty of who sleeps with who's rooming with who. And you're actually given as much detail as possible. And I think, I don't know how you feel on it, but certainly the best coaches that I've ever come across, read about, spoke to, etc., it's always their attention to detail that amazes me / fascinates me, because it does bring us back to the psychology of man, really.
Absolutely, and I think that great coaches are details coaches, but within those details they care passionately about how players process information and whether their players are processing information. And going back to the guided learning piece that you alluded to earlier, and within that tool, that technique of checking for understanding, the beautiful thing about checking for understanding is when you do so, it gets the player thinking. It maybe asks them to reflect back what they've heard, what they understand, and so they're processing the information that you've given to them in a deeper way. And I think, I mean, you work with clubs, with teams. I've found that a conversation I've often had with coaches is, or I've posed the question, how are you helping players process information at a deeper level? You know, and taking responsibility for that, because as you said there, players can just go home and start playing Xbox, playing FIFA. Wow. Is the information that you've you've given to them during the day really going to sink in? Is it really going to be processed at a deep level and then acted upon? I'm not so sure.
Absolutely, and I guess that's part of what we're trying to achieve with it. And as I've said before, I do believe that there's an element where we can do lots to help with them. I think with some athletes, you can use academia. Some are at the stage where they're cognitively mature enough to take things on board and may want to read and do their own research into things. In fact, some players have gone off to study psychology after maybe coming and visiting and stuff like that, which is a really nice thing to see, because it's them trying to understand more maybe about sport, exercise, performance, but more importantly about themselves. And I think the key component for us is, as I've alluded to just before we came on air, is that I do believe that psychology of sport and sport psychology, they are so closely linked, going back through the annals of time. And I think if we're open enough to maybe educate athletes about the origins of psychology, then they can have an interest in it, because a lot of the time the information is relatable to modern sport as such.
So let's get specific here, because you're working with individual players from the PFA of Ireland. I'm obviously not going to name names, but you're working with individual players. You're working with a top amateur team out there as well, who could one day make it through to the top division in Ireland. So what specific challenges have sort of confronted you over the last few months, an individual player or perhaps a coach, and how have you helped either that player or those players or that coach or those coaches deal with that? Because I'm just conscious we've got an audience, and let's try and get specific here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with individual players, it could be very, very little things. Interestingly enough, 30% of the PFAI players here in Ireland actually don't have a junior cert, which would be a very, very early stage of certification in education. So it would probably be the one before A levels for yourselves and the one before a leaving certificate for us. So I think sometimes it's guiding them into the know-how that, you know, possibly a little bit different at Premiership level for players, but this isn't going to last forever. It's a short lifespan.
Yes.
So what can we do to create something outside of the person? And sometimes it's almost a little bit like guidance counselling. You're almost trying to guide them in an area that they've an interest in, but also something that they will like or enjoy. I think we've always made the joke in relation to, everybody has a job, but the people who tend to smile at the end of the day, they have a career. So how can we create a career for these guys, and what can we do to keep them passionate about what they want to do? So sometimes it could be in relation to that, which would be quite easily done, but then other times it might be lifestyle choices, or it might be something a little bit more detailed where it's creating a system or a goal setting plan with athletes, sitting down, seeing what it is they want to achieve. And one of the things that I think goes missing some of the times, and I know Ed O'Connor from the US reverts to this all the time, he talks about simplistic psychology, and I think what you do with athletes sometimes gets overcomplicated. What I love to do with athletes is just literally sit down and say, if I was to strip everything back, tell me 3 primary personality traits of you. And all the time, every time you seem to do it, people kind of get caught, because we do a lot of talking and we interact, and there's a huge amount of social interaction, but how often do we use that thing that we have over every other sentient creature on the planet called introspection? How often do we actually have a genuine look at ourselves? How often do we self-examine? How often do we self-analyse? And how often do we ask the questions, how would I describe myself to somebody who's never met me before? A, being objective, and then B, being almost being the opposite side. I use this phrase with athletes so often, Dan. They're always so hard on themselves. So I heard this phrase many, many years ago saying, put down the bat and stop beating yourself up, because what you've done is fantastic. What you've achieved is fantastic. So there is no need to beat yourself up. And some of these athletes who may have never had a junior cert in their lives, who've come out now and passed and got their certification at the end of it, straight away, the first comment, well, it's only a junior cert. And you're trying to reaffirm to them that no, 12 months ago, it wasn't only a junior cert. It was something you haven't achieved. You were the one who was telling us that you were non-academic, or that you weren't bright or smart. And you've gone out and you've achieved the goal that you set, and we're very proud. And you should also be very proud of yourself, because I think sometimes as athletes, we take success and we want to go on to the next one. And it's a little bit different when you're pulling the athlete out of that sporting environment. And I hope I've answered the question, maybe what you posed initially.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, what I think is really interesting, something I've become more and more engaged in, is the social landscape of competitive sport, and how where the strength of competitive sport can also be its weakness from a human perspective, in as much as we demand so much stretch from players, that future orientation of what better looks like. I need to improve this, I need to improve that, I want to get into the first team. When I get into the first team, I want to stay there. When I'm staying there, I want to move to a bigger club, or whatever it might be, and it's this constant stretch for improvement and better and winning, which, okay, look, that has its useful, advantageous character dispositions, but also that can be an evil as well, as you've kind of eloquently alluded to. You never fully celebrate what you're good at, what you've achieved, what's working. And we really, and I've started to write more and more about this, the importance of mental flexibility, nimbleness with your language. And I think this is where sports psychology is so important, to help coaches, help players be much more nimble, to be able to go, well, look, I'm passionate about improving these areas, and I really need to stretch myself to improve this, and this. But I'm really proud of myself. I'm really delighted. I'm going to celebrate being good at this, and achieving these things. And it's so challenging to get that sweet spot in sport, isn't it? Because sport is all about the stretch. When there's not enough support there's not enough emphasis on players being able to support themselves.
Absolutely, and I think maybe, possibly, and one of the major components why I became involved in sport was my father, and he would always refer back to the underdog. It was the reason why he watched sport. He would always allude to it. It wouldn't matter what sport it was, cricket, soccer, Gaelic, hurling, rugby, whatever, but he would always love for an underdog to win. And I think we do love that story. I think what you're saying there is 100% that sometimes we're future orientated, and we're not looking at it now. I think sometimes when athletes talk about the worries and the ills and the struggles that they have, sometimes I do believe that, as you said at the start, I think the biological basis is so fascinating, and you're trying to get across to them without, and my wife will often slag me over this, saying, you know, you're such a nerd. But I'd often say, like, you know, you will never find a more sophisticated machine on the planet than the human brain. You just can't. I mean, there's an example that I talk to students. There was a young guy in America, I think he was 7 years of age, Gus Brereston was his name, and initially he was having trouble with dexterity and motor skills, and they found black spots on the brain. Now, they got to the stage where the black spots were going to take over the whole hemisphere, and they realised they had a really, really big decision to make, and his parents decided to have a hemispherectomy. So you yourself, Dan, would know that there's a number of functions and things that are taking place on one side of the brain and also on the other side. So initially what they done was a hemispherectomy where the whole right side of the hemisphere was removed, which they thought would result in the young guy losing out on all of his motor skills, somatosensory skills, etc. And he did for a month or two, but the most extraordinary thing started to happen after 1 or 2 months, where neurological plasticity occurred, and the left side of the brain started to acquire these skills that were only previously associated with the right side. And I think sometimes when we break it down into these everyday stories of how flexible, as you've after saying, how nimble even the biological side of the brain is, how fascinating that is for us that we can actually change our behaviour based on these things.
And obviously that young man was in a position whereby neurologically he's forced to face a world where for a period of time he was probably his body was physically handicapped, but as you say, over time, as his left hemisphere started to accommodate that and started to grow itself, these pathways, these areas that actually helped him move more effectively over time.
Absolutely.
Then it's convincing the world that the world who aren't experiencing that same form of handicap, that same form of adversity, that time taken to train the brain is time well spent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the thing that we try to get across to these athletes, and it is quite often what I've alluded to in the past, as I keep referring back to, apologies if I do, but it's the link between clinical psychology and sport psychology, the psychology of sport versus sport psychology, which I've referred to. I think the beauty of it at times is that some of these people involved in clinical psychology, I have a very good friend of mine who's involved in it, who will often take the mick out of sports psychology and say, you're a pseudoscience, etc. And it does be a good bit of crack when we're chatting, but I often say to him, remember that the first ever social facilitation that occurred with Norman Triplett was actually there we go, and it was the first social psychology experiment as well. So in terms of the post-science or the pre-scientific, post-scientific era, they're very closely aligned. So I don't think they can, we're no longer the younger brother as such. I think they're very closely linked, and I think all of them, as I've said previously, a lot of the studies that have been done shows that there is a real close link between them as well. I don't know what way it is for you, but one of the first things that tends to crop up, I done a talk recently, was that a lot of people believe it's a relatively new academic discipline, and I think we're fully aware that sport and exercise psychology has been around for a long, long time.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I mean, interviewed Vern Gambetta, who in the 60s was, as a student, was took a class in sports psychology. So there's your 50-year mark, and as you referred to Norman Triplett's famous social facilitation theory in 1899, which I managed to get in the sports psych show a couple of weeks ago as well. So I was most proud of that. So, but what I think is interesting, because you said the term clinical psychology, and we don't want to go in too much depth here, but coaches and competitors listening in, but it is very relevant. And what I like and what I know about your speaking engagements, because I've seen you talk about it on Twitter, is that your speaking engagements really come under the principle everything psychological is first biological. Everything psychological is first biological. What do you mean by that, mate?
Just absolutely, that we can bring it back to the orientation of glial cells and neurons, and I'd often say to athletes that you're by having an understanding of biological psychology or the different approaches to psychology, but particularly biological psychology, we can then equip ourselves with tools for athletes who may talk to us in relation to something like hydration, for example. Now, going really, really into detail, we could go cellular level, osmosis, etc., the importance of having water there, hydration of that. But when we go to the neuron, when we think of what it is at its basic level, it's an electrical chemical impulse that allows us to communicate. So the more we're hydrated, like all electricity, the more conductive it is. So therefore, by being hydrated, it means that we can think quicker, we can process information much quicker, and therefore it will create decision-making processes that help us. So I would say to an athlete that by being adequately hydrated, if you're thinking of that tackle in the 89th minute when the attacker has got you into the box, you're a defender, if you've been adequately hydrated, your decision making might be to make the tackle, and you might be correct to make the tackle, but the physiology at that stage of the game, if you haven't looked after yourself from a hydration point of view, going all the way back to the neuron, that millimetre, that micrometre, that second is, I missed the ball and I touched the player, and then it's a penalty and we lose the game because of it. So you try to educate them on the biological side of it as well. I think the key component with it as well that I'd often refer to is when we go back to Mark Marlow, the Croatian, who first came up with the word psychology, psyche meaning soul back then, and then obviously ology meaning study or research. I think the first actual definition had the word breath in it. And this to students often as well, saying that the more oxygen, going back to what we said previously, the more oxygen that we take into the body, the more that this body/machine can work effectively. So we're thinking, how can I have a greater performance? Well, don't be afraid to train, or don't be afraid to get somebody in to train people on, progressive muscle relaxation. I had a tweet during the World Cup after Ronaldo's free kick against Spain, and I mentioned that there probably is an element of self-enhancement standing in front of the ball, but I had read on a number of occasions that he was practicing autogenic training, something that a lot of field kickers would take as well, where you're slowing the breath down, making it very deliberate. The more oxygen we take in, the more that it's deliberate, the action. And I think obviously for yourself as well, I remember reading that Johnny Wilkinson said something similar for that most famous goal, the drop goal that he scored to win the World Cup for England. He mentioned about how he was focused on his breathing more so than anything else. So instances like this, they make it really, really easy for us, for sports psych, to almost use, for want of a better phrase, use attribution bias to say, well, if Johnny Wilkinson does it and Cristiano Ronaldo does it, well, then it might be good for James or Jimmy or Mark, down the road.
And I'm kind of picturing Cristiano Ronaldo Googling ways and methodologies to help him just get a little bit better and to help him stay playing top-class football until he's about 50 years old. And I can just imagine autogenic training coming up, and I've got to have a go at that. Let's see what it's all about and learn it. And that's brilliant. I think sometimes we can get lost in the processes, but I think that there is a man who clearly, the great story, which a lot of people will know, but it's worth reciting again, and this is very much the marginal gains, is the story Cristiano Ronaldo in the academy in Sporting Lisbon, and he comes out for one training session and he looks really slow and he looks really sluggish, and all the coaches are asking, well, what's going on with Cristiano today? But they don't do anything about it. He comes out the next day and he's slow and sluggish and not first to the ball, which is unusual because he's always first to the ball. And finally, one of the coaches says, the head coach says, I've got to ask him. Clearly, he's talking in Portuguese and not in English, but my Portuguese isn't what it should be. But he says, I've got to go up and ask him what's going on, because this isn't good. This can't carry on. So he went up, and Cristiano sort of looked at him and innocently and said, well, it could be because of this, and he sort of pulled down his socks and showed the coach that he was wearing leg weights. Because he wanted to get his legs stronger, but clearly it had an impact on his movement and sharpness around the pitch, his ability to get himself around the pitch. But yeah, I mean, there's a guy who seeks no stone left unturned. James, we're absolutely on the same page when it comes to biology, psychology. I mean, for me, biopsychosocial. I'm struggling to find a better model to bring into sport than biopsychosocial. For me, behaviourally, we are biopsychosocial creatures, and at any given time, our behaviour is influenced by our biology, by our psychology and the environment, and the biology is influenced by psychology and social, and the psychology is influenced by biology and social, so that it's all working hand in hand, and that leads to the complexity that is the human being. And I think that, biologically you've talked about brain cells there. I would also talk about predispositional personality traits, which you've already talked about, the extroversion scale, the openness to experience, the neuroticism, etc. But also hormonal. James, when I don't know about you, mate, but when I'm watching sport now, let's take football, I'm watching it, I'm thinking this is just all hormonal. When momentum is against a team and constantly against a team, or when a player starts to release cortisol, the stress hormone, the suppression on his or her actions, the tunnel vision they're experiencing, the slow to anticipate, the slower decision making, for me, that starts biologically. Players are taking in information, making a judgment, their biology is releasing a hormone, and that is influencing how they behave on the pitch.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think what you've mentioned there is it's vitally important in a number of different ways. But one of them is we try to seek an understanding of human behaviour, and that brings us back to our basis of all psychology, I guess. But yeah, the physiology of what's occurring. Yeah, I like that phrase that it is hormonal, and that you see different players sometimes where you've got the different types, etc. Obviously, but particularly within football, as you've mentioned, players, when the psyche of a player when they're winning a game versus the psyche of a player when they're losing a game, how they react, what their behaviour is like, what their body language is like, etc., and so on and so forth. And I think sometimes what irks me is people say, oh, well, it's done at this club, and they allow it at this club, and that's meant to mean that it's okay for players to act in a certain way. A good example of this within football, as opposed to maybe some other sports that kind of irks me at times, is the substitute when a player is coming off, and no player obviously wants to come off, but if you've started the game, you're in a privileged position, and the player who's coming on, I always feel like the way you come off shows your respect to that player and then to the other players who are part of the team. Of course you want to do your best for the team, but I do think, as you said, we've got the pros and cons of elite sport sometimes where we forget almost what it makes people feel like when we react in certain ways. And it is obviously different in certain sports then again, when we think about even reactions in football to referees versus reactions in rugby to a referee. They're polar opposites almost.
I think as human beings we normalise things very quickly in our life, don't we? So for that footballer who's been striving to get into the first team and eventually gets into the first team, and then 3, 4, 5 matches in is substituted, maybe for a tactical reason or because of a passage of poor play, and that player shows irate behaviour, poor body language coming off. I think in large part it's because we're so good as human beings to normalise things. I'm a first team player now, and they forget the struggle that got them into that situation. And as you say, that privilege of being in the team, of I'm privileged to be playing football, like whether that's as a professional or as an amateur, I'm privileged. It's great. Okay, I've got to come off here, and that's fine. Let's do the appropriate individual and team thing, and give the player replacing me the best opportunity to start in the best possible mindset.
Yeah, I think so. I absolutely believe that. And I think sometimes we're preconditioned to these things. One of the things that maybe 6-7 years ago, why I would have maybe stepped away from football as a sport here in terms of coaching, would have been because of things like that. There, you're trying to implement change, but because it's been done previously, or somebody's won a medal or won a trophy implementing certain strategies, etc., it's accepted as the social norm. So, winning first and development second, whereas we were probably fully aware of at this stage, we should be trying to develop young athletes into young human beings, essentially. And as adolescence occurs, as we look at the word adolescence, growth to that sport, whatever it is, we need to be creating systems and values where these people are going into society knowing that what they're doing in sport can be transferred. And I think if we focus on developing athletes as opposed to this winning mentality, then it's much more fruitful for everyone. I mean, it's become a gimmick at this stage. I mean, governing bodies are trying to do it, but I'll give you an instance. 3 or 4 months ago, I was at a quite prominent schoolboy club in this country, went to watch a junior game. And I was just walking around before the game. I hadn't been out to the club recently, and 17 different signs up around the place that said respect for the referee, respect for the coaches, etc., so on and so forth. And as the game began, I just had a quick look at me watch just in case, just to try and time things. And 5 minutes into the game, less than 5 minutes, the coach on the sideline was berating the referee and bringing it back again without maybe boring the listeners. I would often say, I was teaching coaches recently about it, the element of clinical psychology. When you mentioned them in one of the talks that I listened to previously, you mentioned Albert Bandura, and I often say to athletes the importance of the Bobo doll effect, this 5-foot inflatable doll where kids watched adults through this perspex window pick up a wooden mallet and hit this 5-foot inflatable doll, and the majority of the kids went in and actually acted out the same thing. So what does that tell us? You're trying to teach coaches, okay, it's not necessarily what we say, but it's what we do, and children will mimic actions and behaviours sooner than they'll even mimic words. So coaches love to live in a world sometimes which is dangerous. Do what I say, not do what I do. And I think it's a very dangerous thing, particularly with youth sports, to be honest, Dan.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, I know that you travel around Ireland delivering presentations, delivering day sessions, and no doubt you address some of that stuff during the presentation, and you label that P.R.I.D.E psychology. So tell us a bit about P.R.I.D.E, P-R-I-D-E. I think it's an acronym, and then tell us a bit about the content of the course, the session that you do.
Yeah, so initially in 2009, after I became qualified, I was lucky enough to fall into a position as GP referral. So I was actually doing exercise testing prescription for a local general practitioner. And during that time, I was seeking employment, obviously, within teaching. But I decided to set up this business and this company. And I just seen this acronym previously, and I just thought, what envisages you as a person, what envisages you as a coach, as an athlete, as a performer, etc. And I just felt that having personal responsibility in delivering excellence is a key component, not just for us individually, but collectively. And what I like about it, Dan, is it really resonates with me as a person, the fact that I do take personal responsibility, and I think sometimes athletes can negate that. I think sometimes they can say, well, we didn't win because, well, we trained too hard on this day, or we trained on that day. And I, with athletes all the time, say, come back to ownership yourself, take ownership of it. And I think having personal responsibility in delivering excellence on a day-to-day basis brings in every element that we refer to when we speak of sport and exercise psychology. On a one-to-one basis, obviously, it's consultancy work, but for groups, teams, etc., working with GAA clubs, rugby clubs, and a number of different soccer clubs recently, a lot of the course content is what I mentioned earlier. I ask coaches, what is it that motivates you? And I try to at least educate them to an extent where I bring them away from the whole thing of winning first and obviously developing second being one of the oldest things that's there. But I want them to be deliberate in their actions, and I want them to look at themselves. And I do a section on motivation where we look at it. And I think I've spoke to you recently in relation to a little acronym that we came up with in 2009, the DIP principle, saying you will always be able to look at your level of motivation by looking at the direction for D, the intensity in which you act, and then the persistence. So at the moment, I would have a number of students. Their direction would be to obviously come out at the end of the year with their degree or their diploma. The intensity is when they are there. Are they physically there? Are they mentally there? Are they asking questions? Are they interactive? Are they doing things that are going to keep them engrossed within the actual system? And then P, we're getting to that time of the year, and I think the UK is a little bit like Ireland, where the bad weather comes and you're going to work when it's dark and you're coming home when it's dark. And it's the persistence that really differentiates the top athletes, I think, sometimes. It's when it's wet, when it's rainy, when I've missed the first bus, when I can only train at 10 p.m. What is it that will keep athletes persistent in what they're trying to do? And you know what? That works for athletes, but it will work for coaches as well. What is their direction? If it is winning, I always say there is nothing wrong with it, but what we could do for a more fruitful existence for us all is, could you take a step maybe towards senior coaching? Because senior football is a completely different discipline. Senior GAA football is completely, and also obviously hurling, rugby, or any of the different sports will be different than working with junior athletes.
It's so important, and actually, as an aside here, you're talking about the weather in the UK, and I'm looking at how the fog is descending here, and I'm thinking, after this podcast, I had intended to go for a run, so I'm going to use your DIP principle,
Good.
James. So thank you very much for that. As you were talking now, I was thinking about the importance of that ownership piece, players taking ownership of their game. And I think that I'm interested in terms of the conversations you have with coaches on these day courses or when you go into clubs, because again, there seems to be that juxtaposition between coaches having this knowledge, imparting this knowledge, and so subsequently it's very top-down leadership, it's very top-down coaching. It's, I have this knowledge, here's this knowledge, you go and do this knowledge. Whereas obviously we want players to take ownership. So how do you help coaches? Is it using this DIP principle? How do you help players take pride, personal responsibility in delivering excellence, and how do you help coaches to help players do that?
Yeah, it comes in a number of different ways. I think you've come across it yourself. It depends what kind of coach that you have. Sometimes we come across coaches who are fully open to it and they take a full step backwards and allow you to maybe be able to implement, whereas some coaches could be maybe a little insecure at times. I know Ed O'Connor would refer to some coaches sometimes are insecure because they feel, is the player talking about me to the sports psych, and if he is he saying negative things, etc. So the first thing I often say is you need to have a full, honest and frank conversation with coaches. And the problem for young sports psychs, and there's a guy by the name of Matthew Draper in the UK there who has set up something similar just for students, a little bit like yourself, and I was only referring to him recently. He's a really good, I think it's called Phase 2 with the British Psychological Society. But I was saying sometimes it's so hard when you might have a coach who's willing to bring you in and maybe pay you for 16, 18 weeks or maybe months if you're lucky, but then from the get-go that they're not actually involved with what you want. They're not, they don't have the same ethos or they don't have the same philosophy as you, and that it probably won't work because you'll go in, and it's happened before with me where I've worked with athletes for maybe 6 to 8 weeks in pre-season, and as soon as the season has started, the coach has destroyed all of the self-confidence that I've built up, and to a lesser extent, hopefully that self-efficacy, that the player had at least started to believe in themselves a little bit more again. So I think the key component is being honest with yourself, but being honest with that coach, that there has to be a level of understanding that if you're trying to create an open learning environment, that he can't chop that tree down just because he's in a bad mood or he's had a bad day or whatever it is. And if he has had that, which we all do, that he's big enough, and I always say this with anybody. I had a teacher years ago, maybe going off topic here, but he had got something wrong in the class, and just out of pig-headedness more so than anything else would never admit that it was wrong. And still to this day, it's been 15 years since I was in that class, and still to this day it's a motivation for me every day that if a student, a friend, a colleague asks me a question and I don't know the answer, the two hands go up in the sky and I say, I don't know that answer, I don't profess knowledge on this, but I can go and research it if you'd like me to help with it. But I amn't all knowing, and I will go and research it. And I think sometimes the value of that is important. So if you get the coach on board, the coach is on board, then we can communicate to him the importance of maybe, let's say, putting together a goal setting principle, or talking about personality, disposition, and maybe really getting the players together. I think one of the key things sometimes is getting players in and letting other players know what their lifestyle is, because as you alluded to, working with semi-professional teams, most of our guys have full-time jobs before they come training. So I think sometimes if a player is missing for a reason, I think it would be beneficial that if we sat down in a very open learning environment, a very comfortable environment with the athletes, and they're talking about their life or how they've been brought up. Do they have two parents? Has a parent passed away? Is there a certain time of the year when a parent had passed away and it affects players? And I really believe that we've lost a little bit of our connectivity. Although we have a thing called Wi-Fi, we've lost a little bit of our human connectivity in terms of being able to relate to each other. And I think working with teams, that would be one of the biggest things, that I try to get them to relate to each other as human beings first, because at the end of the day, the goal for us collectively is as a team. And I think even with the bigger teams, they'll always have had senior players when you're trying to create a culture who are in line with what you're trying to achieve.
Well, you mentioned there that you occasionally put your hands up and declare that you don't know the answer, but I'm sure you do know the answer to, or have a very, very good answer for many, many questions. So how can they get in contact with you, James? Yeah, so I'm on Twitter as James J. Claffey, P.R.I.D.E psychology on Twitter, and people are always free to email me, just James Claffey, CLAFFEY @gmail.com. As well. I'm always free. I often think, as I said to you, one of the irks which happens with some sources of education and academic snobbery at times is that people often take themselves out of these circles where initially they got in to help people, and I think it's always a testament to the person themselves that they do make themselves open. I think sometimes it's a bit of lip service, or they're looking for maybe a little bit of business or self-promotion, but certainly I would be doing myself a disservice if I wasn't saying that in genuine terms, really on a day-to-day basis, whether it's teams, performance, etc. People who know me most will attest that it's the person first and the player second, or the athlete second, etc. Absolutely, and you allude to self-promotion there, but I know for a fact, having spoken to people and having seen comments on Twitter, that the day sessions, the presentations that you do over in Ireland are always brilliantly received, and people coming away with lots of brilliant ideas. So I suppose a message to everybody out there is it's fill the ports in England and Liverpool and in Wales, and take a trip over to Ireland to watch James present. James, thanks so much for coming on today. Thank you so much, Dan. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. No worries. And to everybody out there, I certainly enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.